It's a devastating irony that the children of Hollywood legends are born into what looks like a fairy tale. The public has always loved this beautiful narrative, that these heirs are already standing at the top of the world, inheriting not just millions of dollars but a paved golden path toward even greater glory. But behind those sparkling red carpets and the roar of flashing cameras lies an entirely different reality. These children never had a choice. Their lives were written into a script long before they could even speak their own names. Some were forced to work like machines from the moment they could walk, their bodies pumped full of drugs just to maintain a perfect smile for the cameras. Some spiraled into addiction so deep that they collapsed before ever reaching adulthood. And then there are those who spent their entire lives desperately trying to expose the truth, that the moral, beautiful image their parents carefully constructed was nothing more than a staged performance designed to hide absolute chaos. Let us peel back each layer of glamour and see clearly what truly happened behind the closed doors of Hollywood's most famous families. The Barrymore dynasty represents perhaps the most haunting example of this curse. As early as the late 19th century in New York, the Barrymore family had already built a theatrical empire that dominated every spotlight. But it was John Barrymore who arrived in Hollywood during the 1920s and turned that name into a global symbol of sophistication. Nicknamed the Great Profile, he earned hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, equivalent to millions today, and lived in the most luxurious mansions imaginable. The public saw an intellectual, elegant, perfectly disciplined artist. But behind that splendor was an artificial shell constructed jointly by the studios and the press. The real John Barrymore was consumed by alcoholism so severe that he could not remember even simple lines. He had to beg staff to hide cue cards all over every set, causing endless filming delays and the cancellation of expensive contracts. This fake perfection became a toxic standard passed directly to the next generation. When Drew Barrymore was born in 1975, she was not welcomed as a normal child. She was welcomed as the heir to a dynasty. At just 7 years old, after the massive success of E.T., she was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per project and had become a global phenomenon. The media portrayed her as an adorable prodigy, a happy angel with that radiant smile on every magazine cover. But in reality, it was a painful performance where a child was forced to live an adult life far too early. While the whole world admired that little girl, at age 9 she had already tasted alcohol. By 12, she had fallen deep into dangerous substance abuse. The tragedy peaked when the so-called angel of Hollywood entered rehab at 13 years old. John was portrayed as disciplined while destroying himself. Drew had to play a happy child while her soul collapsed from within. The pain did not stop there. Her father, John Drew Barrymore, lived an unstable and violent life. Drew made a rare and extreme decision at just 14 years old. She filed for legal emancipation from her own parents just to survive. If the Barrymores represented aristocratic lineage, then Charlie Chaplin rose from extreme poverty in London to become the greatest cultural icon of the 20th century. He built the deeply human image of the little tramp, earning millions and demanding complete creative control. But Chaplin's perfection was a product of extremely sophisticated construction. He rarely allowed the press to touch his real private life, editing each film hundreds of times to create the illusion of flawless, innate genius. Yet his real life was a chain of scandals completely opposite to his compassionate on-screen persona. In 1943, a paternity lawsuit shook his reputation. His marriages to girls as young as 16 made him the target of intense moral criticism. This perfect yet distorted legend created a barrier that prevented his children from finding their own path. Geraldine Chaplin was born in 1944 at the height of media attacks on her father. When she entered acting in the 1960s, she faced a painful psychological paradox. If she acted like her father, the public mocked her as a pale imitation. If she chose a different style, they criticized her for lacking the Chaplin genius. No matter how hard she tried, her name was always attached to the label daughter of the little tramp in every film introduction. Even after appearing in more than 100 films with undeniable talent, she still lived under harsh and unfair comparisons. The father's unimaginable perfection became an immense burden on the daughter's fragile shoulders. Judy Garland's story takes this tragedy to an even darker place. Born in 1922, she rose to immortal fame after The Wizard of Oz in 1939. But few people know that her image of an innocent girl with an angelic voice was actually a brutally manufactured product. MGM Studio established a harsh control system that turned her life into a non-stop production factory. The artificiality did not lie in her acting skills but in every biological breath of her young body. Judy was forced into extreme dieting to maintain a weight below natural levels, leaving her in constant exhaustion. More frighteningly, the studio made her use amphetamines so she could work 18 to 20 hours a day. Then they gave her barbiturates so her body could shut down immediately after leaving the set. Her radiant smile was actually the result of exhaustion cleverly masked by chemicals. Liza Minnelli, her daughter born in 1946, grew up amid applause and her mother's breakdowns backstage. She not only inherited a powerful voice but also received a life script full of traps and pre-written pain. Behind her Oscar for Cabaret in 1972, Liza struggled with alcoholism and dependence on psychiatric medications. The tragedy repeated like a cruel loop as she entered and exited rehabilitation centers continuously from the 1980s to the 2000s. Both mother and daughter were victims of a system that forced people to live in unreal versions of themselves. One was created by Hollywood through chemicals. The other tried to recreate herself under the pressure of surpassing her mother's massive shadow. Kirk Douglas wrote his own fairy tale, rising from a poor Jewish immigrant family to become one of the most powerful stars of the 1950s and 1960s. The public worshipped him as a man of steel, full of courage and self-made strength. But that artificiality lay in constructing a mythologized image to an unrealistic degree. Behind the scenes, his private life contained many dark corners, including serious allegations of inappropriate behavior toward women. Within the family, Kirk was a strict and controlling father who viewed success as a mandatory standard his children had to achieve. Michael Douglas carried an invisible psychological burden, always feeling like a backup version standing under the shadow of a giant tree. He chose dark, morally ambiguous roles as a confrontational strategy, but the effort to rewrite his role came with heavy costs to his mental health. Even his seemingly perfect marriage stood on the brink many times due to the invisible pressures of family legacy. Henry Fonda was molded by studios into the model of the conscience of America, a man who always stood for justice. But behind that public admiration was a cold reality. Henry was a distant father, emotionally controlled to a harsh degree, almost never showing warmth to his children. When Jane Fonda's mother ended her life, Henry told his children she died of a heart attack. Jane, then only 12 years old, grew up in a false illusion of happiness until she discovered the harsh truth through tabloid pages. This deception created a deep psychological scar. Jane spent her entire life exposing the artificiality of a perfect dynasty, but the pain of a child deprived of genuine recognition always lingered. The Eastwood family chose a different path. Clint Eastwood built an empire from the image of the solitary, strong figure who solves everything with silence. But his private life is a labyrinth of multiple affairs and at least 8 children with different women. Kyle Eastwood faced an overwhelming masculine icon so immense that any attempt at acting would become a subject of ridicule. He chose to hide behind jazz melodies, working on film scores for his father's movies. Despite achieving success with quality jazz albums, he still cannot avoid being introduced as Clint's son at every event. Kyle gave up the brightest spotlight in exchange for a breath of freedom in the shadows of jazz clubs, far from Hollywood's gaze. John Wayne was not just an actor, he was a religion of masculinity worshipped by Hollywood for half a century. Major studios poured millions into forging an invincible hero. But behind that imposing image was a personal life filled with 3 divorces and darker ideological aspects carefully concealed. His son Patrick was forced to fit into his father's oversized coat, trained from voice to posture to resemble a John Wayne version. He was not seen as an independent artist but merely a preserved version of the legacy. Patrick spent his entire life as the shadow of a giant, knowing he could never surpass a standard that had been perfectly fabricated. Paul Newman was Hollywood's living saint, elegant, immensely talented, with a model marriage lasting half a century. But that very pressure to be perfect created one of the most refined forms of artificiality in history. The velvet curtain was torn apart in 1978 when his son Scott Newman's body was found after a drug overdose at age 28. Melissa Newman grew up in immense wealth but witnessed the collapse of the ideal image from within. She chose a quiet retreat from the spotlight, turning to sculpture and music to make herself invisible before the blinding Newman name. And finally, Ryan O'Neal cast his 10-year-old daughter Tatum in Paper Moon to reinforce his image as a perfect father. While the public believed in their perfect connection, Tatum lived in a fractured family environment, neglected and exposed to chaotic adult parties from a very young age. She won an Academy Award at 10 years old, the youngest winner in history, but that achievement became the beginning of her descent into darkness, fueled by jealousy from her own father. The lowest point came in 2008 when the once brilliant actress was arrested for involvement in illegal street transactions. Ryan once attempted to flirt with a woman at his partner's funeral, not realizing she was actually Tatum, his own daughter. Behind these famous surnames are not just million-dollar fortunes and golden statues. There are silent battles to escape a script written by public expectations and the oversized egos of parents. After all, the true legacy these children long for is not fame. It is the right to live an authentic life, free from the staging and the glittering masks of Hollywood.